Join our community by subscribing. Every click helps us share more stories like this one. The introduction. The air was thick with an unnerving stillness as dawn stretched its fingers across the small town of Maplewood. A thin veil of fog lingered, clinging to the damp ground, and the distant sound of a train whistle echoed across the tracks like a ghostly reminder of life moving forward. It was early July, and residents had settled into their routines, unaware that a storm was gathering just beyond the horizon. Amidst this quaint scenery, a particular house at the end of Elm Street had seen better days. Shutters hung askew, paint crumbled off the eaves, and the yard had become a wild tangle of weeds. No one could remember the last time the Johnson family had stepped out to greet their neighbors. They had always been reclusive, the kind of family whose silence invited speculation. It was this house, under the watch of an indifferent son, that became the epicenter of a tragedy that would shatter the illusion of safety in Maplewood. On that July morning, the shrill ring of a telephone interrupted the tranquility. It was the sound that would set a series of events into motion, that would transform the sleepy town into a stage for a thriller. In the cramped office of Maplewood's police department, Detective Sarah Hart was staring at a wall, marked with photographs and notes of a case still open, yet long gone cold. As that phone call came through, her instincts kicked in, alerting her to the impending chaos. Little did she know, this case would dig up buried secrets, unravel familial bonds, and reveal that darkness often lurks behind the most unassuming doors. The victim. The victim was 12 years old, a girl whose laughter should have echoed joyfully through the halls of a school and danced playfully on a playground. Her name was Emily Johnson, a name that once brought visions of innocence and boundless potential. Now, it was etched in sorrowful permanence across the memories of the town's residents. Emily had been the apple of her parents' eye, often seen frolicking through the neighborhood with her worn-out sneakers and a bright pink bicycle that seemed to support her adventures. She had animated stories to tell, a world to explore, and friends to charm with her infectious smile. But it was her reclusive life, steeped in a suffocating silence at home, that masked her reality. Days before the discovery of her lifeless body, Emily's absence stirred concern among her friends. The chatter on the streets grew uneasy, whispers spinning into frantic gossip, each rumor darker than the last. People spoke of bickering parents, wondering if they had failed her. They checked in on one another, but steered clear of the Johnson house, as if it were shrouded in a sinister fog that rendered it untouchable. When Emily went missing, the search for her flooded social media, fueled by a community desperate for answers. Posters adorned every lamppost, her wide-eyed face smiling back at them, pleading for their help. It brought together a web of watchers, volunteers, and worried families, each person contributing to the effort with fervor that masked their dread. But it was the discovery in the woods, beyond the feral cluster of trees, that delivered the hard blow of aching truth that shattered lives. Emily had been found, lying still, vulnerable, the once vibrant spirit now just another headline in a world drowning in tragedy. This was not merely a death, it was the brutal punctuation to a short life, intertwining with a chilling mystery that demanded to be unraveled. The crime scene. The forest loomed like a sentinel, shadows stretching ominously beneath the towering pines as Detective Sarah Hart arrived at the scene where Innocence had been starkly robbed. A light drizzle began to fall, the patter on the leafy canopy echoing the somber mood that hung heavy in the air. Officers guided her along a narrow path, knees cracking with every careful step along the spongy earth that hid the details of the crime beneath layers of fallen leaves. As they reached a secluded clearing, the oppressive silence enveloped them, punctuated only by the distant call of a mourning dove. It felt wrong to intrude on this fragile serenity, but the stark reality of the tragedy demanded her attention. A single flashlight flickered beside the lifeless form of Emily Johnson, illuminating details that were both haunting and heart-wrenching. She lay still, surrounded by the damp moss and swirling autumn leaves, the vibrant colors now dulled by tragedy. Her clothes, once bright and untainted, were torn, and the dirt clinging to her skin told a story of a struggle far from home. Detective Hart knelt down, her breath catching in her throat as she surveyed the scene. It was a narrative written in loss, punctuated by a silence that screamed for justice. The coroner stood quietly at her side, a mix of professionalism and sorrow exuding from every movement. Hart turned to ask about the preliminary findings, though she already knew the answers would be cold and unyielding. As they examined the positioning of the body, forensic markers began to outline the scene, each one telling a small fragment of Emily's last moments. To the left of her body lay a tree, branches swaying gently as if mourning the young girl lost to cruelty. Signs of a struggle, the coroner noted. Shifting closer, multiple abrasions on her arms and neck, suggesting she fought. Emily's face bore a serene expression that stood in stark contrast to the violence her small body had endured. But the truth lingered just below the surface, like a shadow ready to claim its next victim. As the day drew on, and the fog encroached once more, Hart felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. She had just begun to peel back the layers of Emily's life, and now time ticked onward, ever so mercilessly. There were questions to answer, leads to uncover, and a truth that begged to be revealed on she hoped would bring closure to a grieving community. The early investigation. Detective Sarah Hart stood at the helm of an unfolding investigation, the precinct bustling around her with voices and movements chaotic, yet focused. Maps plastered the walls, various colored pins indicating places of interest, potential witnesses, and leads that ebbed and flowed like the tide. The urgency thrummed beneath their skin, an underlying current of hope that somewhere lay an answer to the darkness hovering over Maplewood. The first responsibility was to reach out to the family. After the agonizing discovery of Emily's body, her parents were inconsolable, their anguish palpable even over the phone. Hart gathered a team, and they prepared for the difficult task ahead, to untangle the web of grief and mistrust that bound the Johnsons. She needed to understand their world, peek through the window into their history, and uncover who Emily was beyond the walls of their home. Rounding up school officials, Hart learned more about Emily's last days. Had she seemed withdrawn? Did she have friends? The answers were a mix of promotional materials for summer programs that never found their way into Emily's hands, and whispered regrets from teachers who wished they had reached out sooner. Emily was bright, but there was something off, the school principal explained. eyes darting as if she expected accusations. Her parents were always so protective, she rarely attended extracurricular activities. It was as if Emily had been shrouded in armor, shielded from the world by a family that was both devoted and suffocating. With each interview, tiny morsels of Emily's existence fell into place. She loved to draw, her notebooks filled with sketches of fantastical worlds. A classmate mentioned a budding friendship with another girl, but when pressed for details, she hesitated, looking down at her sneakers as if they held secrets she wasn't ready to share. "Did you ever notice anything unusual?" Hart asked, carefully crafting her questions. "Not really, but..." The girl paused. Sometimes she acted scared of going home. The words hung in the air, a chilling whisper of Emily's life that spiraled deeper into a maze yet to be fully explored. The hours melted into dusk, the light waning like hope. Hart felt the walls close in around her as she connected the dots each interview, each detail weaving a narrative that hinted at darker realities. Somewhere beneath the surface of Emily's life lay a truth she was determined to uncover. But with each passing day, the pressure to find answers only intensified, bringing with it the toll of an entire community yearning for justice. The dead ends. The days turned into a blur of interviews, evidence collection, and community outreach. Each lead came with its own promise, but time was slipping away faster than the investigators could grasp it. As Detective Sarah Hart sat at her desk, she watched the clock tick slowly towards another dusk. The darker it got outside, the more the sense of urgency grew in the precinct. One lead had pointed them to a neighbor, an eccentric man named Harold Thompson, who lived 3 houses down from the Johnsons. His penchant for peculiar behaviorist analytics of thrift store, fines, and conspiracy theories about government surveillance had once entertained street corners, but now raised alarming red flags. Just odds and ends painted him as an oddity rather than a suspect. Despite the wild stories, Hart found nothing to solidify a connection to Emily. He was repeatedly ruled out, but she sensed he was hiding something, a detail that never materialized into hard evidence. Frustrated and restless, Hart turned her focus to the Johnson home itself, revisiting it with fresh eyes. The house was a trove of memories, and yet they all felt like masks hiding the truth. Scouring the bedrooms for clues, she uncovered Emily's drawings, capturing her vibrant imagination. But there was a stark difference in the sketches that sent a chill down her spine. Some were playful, but others depicted dark, scene-isolated figures surrounded by blank spaces. The deeper Hart dug, the more dead ends seemed to surface. Local bars were checked for any sign of concerning patrons. Social media was scrutinized for any leads or red flags, and the quiet tides of Maplewood were notably indifferent to the chaos beneath. Almost every promising lid dissolved into thin air when confronted with reality, and Hart could feel the pressure mounting. Every unanswered question rolled over into the next, a relentless wave determined to drown her resolve. Then, news broke of a young man, Alex Sullivan, arrested for a petty theft in a sleepy town miles away. He had a history of substance abuse and a few mentions of wandering around neighborhoods without purpose had sparked interest. But once again, hope turned to ash when a background check revealed no solid connection to Emily or her family. With every thwarted lead, doubts began to surface among Hart's colleagues. Was it time to reassess the case? Meanwhile, the community's heartaches stooped to a shadow of anger. The clock was ticking. As the days stretched past, she clung fiercely to the belief that somewhere in this intricate puzzle lay the answer. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate in a landscape filled with shadows and silence. A break in the case. As summer deepened, the oppressive heat settled over Maplewood, tightening its grip on the townspeople, just as the tension within the investigation reached a boiling point. Detective Sarah Hart was weary, her mind playing a relentless game of scenarios while sipping bitter coffee that had long gone cold. Then came the call that would change everything. A flicker of hope amid creeping despair. It was early evening when dispatch reported a tip-off from an anonymous caller who claimed to have seen a girl matching Emily Johnson's description in the company of an unfamiliar man near the local park days before her disappearance. The caller insisted the interaction seemed off, an unsettling rapport that left them anxious. It was just enough to rekindle the momentum the case desperately needed. Hart hurriedly assembled her team, determination surging through her veins. The park, an expanse of nature tangled with joy and laughter, now cast ominous shadows as they arrived. It was a gathering spot for families, but the atmosphere felt electric with anxiety. Officers began canvassing the area, retracing Emily's last known steps, while Hart focused on locating potential witnesses. One elderly couple was sitting on a bench nearby, their weathered faces grim. They had witnessed a confrontation just a few days before. "It was strange," the woman said, peering quietly at Hart over her glasses, fingers trembling slightly. "A girl and a man." She looked scared. She grimaced, as if recalling a phantom pain. It was like he was forcing her to stay. The couple's testimony painted a clearer picture, a confirmation that something ominous lay within the shadows of that park. Hart leaned forward, her heart racing with an urgency she hadn't felt in weeks. She took note of the man's features, struggling to conjure up a portrait from their fragmented memories. They recalled a baseball cap, a distinct tattoo on his forearm, an aura that sparked alarm. In the days that followed, the police department worked tirelessly to identify the man. Images from nearby surveillance cameras were scrutinized, timelines established, and social media scoured for clues. As the investigation dug deeper, they unearthed the name of a local who had been known for trouble, but had slipped quietly below the radar. Ryan Mills, a 27-year-old with a history of petty crime and disputes with neighbors that lent credence to his volatile reputation. Hart felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her as she shared this development with her team. The pieces began to connect. Emerging connections from his past incidents hinted at a person who thrived on manipulation and intimidation. As her team prepared to track down Mills with a renewed vigor, Hart couldn't shake the feeling of gravity pulling her down. They were edging closer to uncovering the truth, but it was laced with uncertainty, a reminder that even a breakthrough also meant stepping deeper into the unknown and the potential for danger lurking closer than they realized. The suspect. Ryan Mills was not what one might expect of a typical suspect. With tousled hair and an easy smile that could disarm a stranger, he resembled an everyday man rather than the lurking menace that the investigation suggested. However, Sarah Hart understood the weight of appearances. It was what lay beneath the surface that often held the darkest secrets. The morning after the lead on Mills emerged, Hart gathered her team to strategize. "We have a history of violent encounters," she reminded them, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "He's known for intimidation tactics, but nothing overtly violent that would tie him to Emily. Yet, we need to proceed with caution." They conducted background checks, delving into his life, scouring police reports, and interviewing neighbors. It revealed a pattern of behavior that painted Mills as someone who thrived on control. His previous arrests had all been for assault or drug-related offenses, ultimately bouncing from rehabilitation programs to the street. Rumors among locals whispered of a hobby that might not be so innocent. Young girls often felt uneasy in his vicinity. Hart also learned he had recently lost his job at a local auto repair shop due to conflicts with coworkers, complaints about aggression, and a volatile temperament surfacing like ink in water. It generated a flicker of a motive, a man teetering on the edge of desperation. As they pieced together this puzzle, a plan emerged to apprehend Mills for questioning. With a warrant finally inked, they devised the approach carefully. Hart set a perimeter around his known hangouts while uniformed officers stayed hidden in the shadows, ready to move when the time proved right. It wasn't long before they spotted him, leaning against a dilapidated building, flicking a cigarette into the remnants of the day. An officer signaled, and an unease settled in the pit of Hart's stomach. In synchrony, they moved in, surrounding him, and the atmosphere thickened with the tension of unspoken questions. Mills looked up, surprise morphing quickly into a steely composure, as if he had expected something was coming. "Ryan Mills?" Hart stepped forward, her voice firm but measured. He eyed them, feigning disinterest, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed an underlying anxiety. The tension of the moment held them all captive as she prodded him about Emily Johnson, each question sharper than the last. Mills deflected, smirking, tossing out statements meant to deflect blame, but Hart could see the cracks in his facade. "I know you were at the park on the date. Emily went missing," she pressed, leaning toward him. "Witnesses saw you engage with her." For a moment, silence hung between them like an unsaid agreement. Mills' bravado faltered, and a heavy silence descended, punctuated only by the distant sirens that underscored their confrontation. His eyes flickered, revealing just a hint of the kind of fear that comes when the walls begin to close in around you. But just as swiftly, the mask returned. "I don't know what you're talking about," he shot back, shrugging nonchalantly. "You can't pin this on me." Hart's heartbeat quickened. This was only the beginning. They would require undeniable evidence to unravel Mills' web of delusions before they could bring him to justice. With every question, she felt they were merely scratching the surface of a deeper darkness that awaited unraveling. The trial. The courtroom was a battleground, a stark contrast to the quiet contours of Maplewood. It echoed with the murmurs of anticipation, reflective faces, waiting for the unfolding of a narrative layered with anguish and heartache. The air inside was tense, charged with the emotions of a community gripped by the tragedy of a child's life lost too soon. Emily Johnson's name hung heavily in the room, intertwining with the whispers of justice. Detective Sarah Hart sat in the back, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Ryan Mills, once a figure of mockery cloaked in a perceived charm, now stood framed in a gray suit that belied the chaos within. His demeanor betrayed no remorse, only a defiance that seeped into the room like a creeping fog. Silent but unmistakably present was the weight of the evidence gathered against him, a meticulously woven tapestry built upon the testimonies and findings that pointed toward his involvement in Emily's death. The prosecution presented each piece with precision. Witness statements from neighbors who had seen Mills in the park were layered with urgency, creating a timeline that aroused the jury's horror. The forensic evidence, too, played a lead role, with DNA samples linking Mills to the scene. Each moment brought fresh waves of disbelief. The community gasped collectively, recalling the vibrant girl they had all loved and lost. Yet Mills remained unyielding as his attorney painted a different picture. A victim of circumstance, the defense argued, skillfully dismantling the testimonies, flinging doubt like confetti. He raised questions about the reliability of witnesses, expertly leaning on the idea that a local perception of Mills had tainted their accounts. Under the strain of the courtroom drama, Hart felt the sense of unease wash over her. Behind bars, the man she believed responsible might yet evade the justice they pursued. There were moments where Mills' bravado collided against the evidence, yet the pulse of doubt seemed alive and well, whispering to the jury, was it enough? As the trial progressed, Hart learned to read the expressions of the jurors, their attentiveness confined to the moments where Mills spoke, where his charm could perhaps reweave the narrative. Each evening, she would replay the day's events in her mind, focusing on the strength of Emily's story, determined that her brightness would prevail against Mills' dark. After weeks of testimony, the courtroom buzzed in anticipation of the closing arguments. Hart held her breath as the prosecutor delivered a passionate plea, underscoring the weight of the evidence-the loss of a child for no good reason. The message of hope for justice overshadowed by the reality. As the trial drew to a close, the jury left to deliberate. Hart felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, the uncertainty of justice hanging in the balance. Could they find an unanimous agreement in a world that sometimes felt eclipsed by shadow? It was a moment suspended in time, a breath held in collective hope. Would it be a verdict that echoed justice, or an unresolved lament that would linger long into the future? In a flash, the verdict would either shatter or mend a community still grappling with the loss of Emily Johnson. The aftermath. The gavel rapped sharply, resonating like a drum beat in the throats of those gathered in the courtroom, the sound that determined fate. When the jury returned with their verdict, the air grew thick with tension, anticipation hanging thickly amongst every soul present. Sarah Hart clenched her hands into fists, her heart thudding loudly in her ears as the foreman read the words. We find the defendant, Ryan Mills, guilty of the charges against him. A collective gasp surged through the room, quickly swallowed by a wave of relief. But as the weight of this verdict hung in the air, a bittersweet realization settled within Hart's chest. Justice had indeed been served for Emily Johnson, but it was not without cost. The invisible scars left on the community would take much longer to heal than any courtroom could mend. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood turned its eyes toward recovery. A memorial was erected in a small park, usually filled with the laughter of children previously dimmed by tragedy. On the day of the unveiling, where flowers and colorful drawings encapsulated the spirit of Emily, Hart stood amongst distraught yet hopeful residents. It was a grieving but healing community, bound together by shared sorrow and determination to honor a girl whose life had been cut short. Media headlines echoed the good and the bad, gripping the public in narratives that felt far too familiar. Hart had braced herself for the fallout. Questions swirled about the effectiveness of preventive measures, about parenting in a culture entrenched in silence and secrets. The aftershocks rippled across the town as families began to discuss what had once been considered taboo. Hart herself felt the heavy burden of the case linger like a lingering shadow, tainting the spaces she occupied. The emotional tug-of-war twisted deeper within, with memories of Emily's smile flashing through her mind during quiet moments. The exhaustion from the investigation had transformed into a resolve. She contacted local schools to provide workshops about safety, communication, and awareness. If she could instill even a flicker of change, she would consider it a small victory against the darkness that had encroached upon their innocence. As the town began to heal, Hart discovered glimmers of light through the cracks. Neighbors forged new connections. Friends turned to strangers for support. Talks shifted from silence to shared fears. Emily's story may have begun and ended in tragedy, but had spurred a movement of thirst for vigilance, for understanding the perils masked within community. Yet, the reality remained stark. While Mills would serve time for his heinous actions, the roots of fear and grief would linger. For every person who came forward with tales of bravery, there would also be stories left unheard. Just as Hart thought the chapter could close, she knew she would carry Emily's light with her, an unyielding flame, to fight against the darkness that still resided in hidden corners. And as she left the memorial that day, she looked forward to a tomorrow poised on the edge of possibility, heartened by the thought that perhaps change was possible, even born from heartbreak. Reflection. In the quiet moments that followed the memorial, Sarah Hart found herself wandering through the park where Emily had often played. Memories of laughter and innocence washed over her like a bittersweet tide. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows, she reflected on the frailty of life and the strength found in community. Her thoughts drifted to the families they had connected with throughout the investigation, those who'd grown fearful yet resolute, pushing for change in the face of horror. It amazed her how the human spirit had a way of binding souls together, even through the most gruesome of experiences. With every conversation she had initiated, every workshop she had organized, she saw a flicker of hope emerge from the depths of despair. But there was still a haunting reminder of the void left by Emily's absence, an emptiness that lingered in the air. Hart felt the weight of that loss nestled deep within her chest, a reminder of her motivation. Her resolve solidified. She would continue to be a voice for the silenced, ensuring that Emily's story was not merely a statistic or a headline, but a constant reminder that every life mattered. She stepped forward, determined to advocate for those who couldn't, refusing to let fear stifle her pursuit of safety for the children of her community. With a final glance at the memorial, Hart breathed in the crisp air, vowing to keep Emily's light alive, lighting a path for others to follow, to find safety in truth. In that moment of reflection, she felt a burgeoning sense of purpose. Healing was an ongoing journey, and though the scars of trauma would always remain, the potential for change and understanding had begun to blossom. Hart embraced the uncertainty of tomorrow, holding tightly to the fragile hope that one day darkness could be dimmed by the unwavering strength of love and community.